Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and tonight we're going to talk about some of the challenges and outright threats to historic preservation in the distressed cities of Connecticut, of which New London is one. My guest tonight is Jean Dismay, who is the former first selectman of Wyndham, and we're going to talk about some of the challenges that New London and Willimantic share related to preserving old buildings.
And Putnam.
And well, I don't know much about Ansonia either, but it's impacted. But yes, this show does go out to Putnam as well as to the New London area. So if there are any Putnam viewers who want to call in and talk about what's happening there and the concerns that the residents there might be having, feel free to. We'll put up the phone number periodically. So welcome, Jean.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess, you've been involved in politics in Willimantic for as long as I've known you.
Right.
But how did you become interested in historic preservation?
That's interesting. I think I've always been a fan. Probably the reason I got drawn to Willimantic is because of the old buildings in the historic downtown, and the Victorian homes. I'm a member of the Victorian Neighborhood Association. I don't live in an old house. I live in a new house, but I put gingerbread on it. So they're so unique. I grew up in New Jersey, right? So I grew up in a Cape, and then we moved to a subdivision, and then there was this big mall, and it was all stuff I really never liked. And there was one little town near us, Caldwell, New Jersey, if anybody's from there. Yay! And that's where we played. It was a historic downtown, and that's where we hung out and did our, just hung out as a bunch of teenagers on the street. So I think that's part of what drew me to living in Willimantic. It was a place where, just comfortable, lots of friendly people, very different from living at that time I moved from stores. I love old buildings. And then I think I worked in construction, for 40 years as an electrician. And so I really appreciate the old buildings and how well built they are, and how the fact that we do not build them like that at all anymore, and you cannot duplicate what we're losing.
No, in fact, I feel like we don't really appreciate it. I grew up in Philadelphia in a row house, but not an old neighborhood. It was a new row house neighborhood that was built in the early 1950s. Mm-hmm. And I really can't say I appreciated it. But there are a lot of really old houses there.
Philly has some the West End, right? And and that's going to be one of the first places that I went to, is the Philly West End.
Yeah, so there is great
housing.
And I, until I traveled around and I went and lived in places that are newer in the United States, I really did not appreciate what we have here.
Yeah, right. When you travel out west and you go to Denver or something and there's nothing old, and it's very strange. And every place you go looks exactly the same as you drive across the country.
My in-laws are in Oregon, mostly in the Salem area. And when we told them that we bought a house that was built in 1892, in New London, that doesn't really impress people all that much, because if it's not older than about 1860, it's really not a big deal here.
Right.
There were a lot of neighborhoods that were built in the late 1800s here, but when we told his
after the fire,
parents,
there's probably a lot of new.
When we told my in-laws that we had bought a house from 1891. They were so impressed by it, because in Salem, Oregon, I think the oldest building in town is from about 1870. And so anything that was built before about 1920 is really old to them.
Right.
And it was kind of at that point that I realized that we just don't, we take for granted what we have here.
Yes. And then in Wyndham, we have the villages out, the Willimantic is the industrial new city, right? And then you have the villages which are colonial period. So they were out there in the French and Indian war period, Revolutionary War. Great stories. That's part of it, the great stories that they have.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I don't think I'd like to live inland. I like being near the ocean. But whenever I drive through Wyndham, whether it's through Willimantic, the city part of it, or I'm taking back roads, the architecture is just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, other towns have more phenomenal architecture. I drive through Norwich and I go, wow. But it's a good, comfortable, friendly, great place to live.
Now, the thing that got us talking about the subject, I think even less than a week ago, is some legislation that is being considered in Hartford this year that is really concerning. So maybe talk about how this is.
Right. So I'm embarrassed and sorry to say that the representative, a state representative from Wyndham, Susan Johnson, I'm sure with the encouragement of the town attorney and the town manager, came up with a piece of legislation that the first iteration would have affected any building that was empty for 5 years anywhere in the state. And so it would just allow people to demolish. So I should probably explain right now what New London went through and Wyndham is going through is that if somebody wants to demolish a building, in a commercial building that's in a National Historic Register district and is on the register, we have the right to appeal that owner's desire to demolish and say that there's other alternatives. And the state will look and see, are there other viable alternatives to demolition that, we're not asking the owner to lose everything. We're asking them to change their plans to another alternative that's more historic friendly, preservation friendly.
And in fact, in my view, any owner who has purchased a house knowing
this,
that it's in that kind of district knows that there are some more stringent requirements than purchasing a building somewhere else in town.
And in this case, we were already filed suit with the State Historic Preservation Office, so he knew very well exactly what he was walking into, and he bought the buildings anyway. But so the whole plan is to get rid of our opportunity to appeal demolition. And the legislation says if its building's been empty for 10 years, then, and if it's in an opportunity zone, in a distressed municipality of under 30,000 people. So they're trying to whittle away a lot to get rid of the opposition. Then we can have the demolition and you don't have the right to appeal. And they've whittled it away so that's only affecting 4 communities in Connecticut. And that's Ansonia, Putnam, New London, and Wyndham. And so they're hoping 165 legislators will vote for this.
Because their towns aren't affected and they really won't feel strongly about it.
Right, they won't look at the law. And so the Democrats, definitely, it's them, are strong-arming each other to say, oh, Susan Johnson has seniority, this is the only thing she's asking for, you have to vote for this piece of legislation. And so what I'm hoping through your show and other newspaper articles and stuff is to encourage people in any town to tell your legislator, no, why would these 4 towns get singled out not to have the same rights as every other town in the state?
And this has happened quite a lot. It's very frustrating, the whole, eminent domain, Fort Trumbull
you
suit.
have the history here.
One of the things that got the Green Party involved in it was that it was kind of an unequal protection under the law situation, that if you lived in a distressed municipality only, then your property could be taken solely for the purpose of putting it to a use that might generate more tax dollars.
And this is a good parallel because it's solely a distressed municipality and it's all about he's waving money around and knock everything down if he's going to throw money at us, right? Don't ask questions.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe we'll talk a little farther on in the show about what sound economic development looks like, because that probably isn't it. But
I want to put one more thing, since we just talked about the distressed municipalities. One of the things that they consider when they look at what's a distressed municipality is the age of the buildings. Are your buildings over 50 years old? Oh, it must be a distressed municipality.
I didn't know
We love our old buildings.
And it doesn't necessarily mean we're distressed at all, but
no, it's one of the things that counts towards your points of being distressed.
But the funny thing is, I know, I read the Strong Towns blog fairly frequently, and they've done the math, and very often it's the poorer neighborhoods with small parcels that are kind of distressed that are subsidizing the more affluent places.
Wow.
And I think within a big city, the poorer neighborhoods are often subsidizing the wealthier ones. And in Connecticut, the compact old towns are generating more tax money, and the infrastructure costs of supporting the suburbs are higher. So this part of the reason we're distressed is that we're subsidizing everyone else.
Yeah, it's unfair taxation. That's the problem with the state in general.
So let's look a little bit at the buildings.
There she is.
Right.
Yeah, I'm like, there's no way that building's falling down. That building is so well built. It's got, the 18-inch masonry walls with rebar. That's the big hotel, Hale. So the one on, I don't know, the one with the wooden porches is the Hotel Hooker, and was named after a famous person in some war, Hooker, Colonel Hooker, his family.
It was probably the butt of many jokes over the
years, right? But he had the name first, okay? So that's a brick building with wood infrastructure. And that was one of the best hotels in the state of Connecticut when it was built in 1886 or something. And then that kind of became obsolete. And the Hale Hotel, which is next to it, was built in around 1905, I'm guessing, 1929. And it was built by a community effort where people in the community raised money, and they went out, 150 different people went out and raised money and beat the drum and said, we need a new hotel in town. And they built this new wonderful hotel, which was the best hotel. And, progress is part of what changed their uses. And cars, which are parked in front of it. But the problem is there aren't enough parking spots for all those rooms back then even, which were hundreds of rooms. So they fell on hard times. Eastern, at some point, bought the big one, the Hale, for student housing. They didn't have enough housing in, I think, 1968. And they brought in a freshman class and they had no rooms for these, and it was for women that they brought in. And I think Faith Middleton was in the article that I read, and I haven't contacted her to say, do you remember this? She went to Hartford with these other students, as seniors, and they did a sit-in in the Capitol in Hartford and said, you will buy this building for our dorms because we need the space. And within a week, the state had bought the building and used it for dorms. Now, the campus is kind of far away from there, half a mile or whatever, not far, but the campus expanded out where the campus is, and they didn't need that hotel anymore. And then they just didn't use it much.
So how long has it been out of use?
Well, they'll tell you with my town manager keeps saying 40 years, and so does Susan Johnson, but it was not. It was used for their facilities department. It was emptied out probably finally about 18 years ago, 17 or 18 years ago. And then CHFA bought it. And they also didn't try to sell it or use it. They just sat on it and didn't do anything. And then about 10 years ago, they sold it to the new owner, who did not attempt to sell it and did nothing with it. And then 2 years ago, he finally decided he owned both buildings and decided to sell them both. So one of these big things is, oh, the buildings have been empty for so long. Well, that was the owner's decision. It's not like he was out there trying to fill them up. They were just sitting there because the owner chose not to fill them.
Well, it seemed like I looked at some old newspaper articles about, the Hooker Hotel in particular.
Yeah.
And, I want to say around 2000, maybe 15 to 20 years ago, Willimantic was getting really bad public relations.
Yes, they were.
Really bad. So you felt as though, oh, if you went to Willimantic, it's like everyone is a heroin addict.
Yes.
It really, I was shocked that the tone was just like, this place is just a disaster. No one would ever want to come here and visit or live here.
Yeah. I went to Yukon 40 years ago, right? And at that time, they told me, whatever you do, don't go to Willimantic. It's this horrible slum. It's very dangerous. And so finally, I went there because that's where you got food stamps. It's always been a service center. So I went, and I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool town. I like it. And somebody asked me, you want to play softball? I was like, sure, that sounds like fun. And then I moved there. It's had that reputation, is my point, for a very long time. There was one article in The Current, and that was 19 years ago, 18 years ago, which totally smeared the town. We should have sued The Current. I guess there's nothing you can do. But that really set the town back. The Mill Museum was open. They had a hard time getting people to come. But that's all in the past. The building's been empty for 10 years. So, and I have to say it because it's true. A lot of people lived in the building. That was the smaller building, the one on the right as we're looking at it. A lot of people lived there. A lot of people of all sorts of kinds of people, of different means.
Yeah.
And I started Third Thursday the year before that article because the town, like every other small town, was just hitting hard times and there were empty buildings. We were trying to get people to come back downtown. The people who lived in the Hooker Hotel were the ones who helped me. They came out and helped me set up tables and chairs and stayed out with me and helped me put them back in at the end of the night. So did the people at the soup kitchen. That was my help. So, it wasn't the town government lifting a finger. It still hasn't been.
Well, yes.
So stop. Who's contributing to our community, right?
Right. And here's another picture that shows it more from the other side of it.
Yeah, so somebody added this deco entrance, which is kind of, we'll be taking that off. Might have been cool at the time.
Yeah, it doesn't do it justice. But
No.
I took these pictures. I went to Google Street View, and one thing that really I won't say it impressed me, but I couldn't help but notice, just kind of cruising around online, was that right across the street
It's an empty lot.
is an empty building lot.
Right.
And, you can even look here, you can go down the street and see the building,
Yeah.
the threatened buildings to your right and the lot
On
to
the
to
left.
your left.
So why would a developer want to come in and go through removing all the asbestos and the lead and whatever else might be in there, and then demolition costs, which are going to be expensive, you're right, on Main Street, and it's a big, heavy building. I mean, a lot of wasted
the Hale
material.
building in particular.
Wasted
is-
material. But why would you want to do that when there's an empty lot right there? And there's more than one. We have lots of empty lots.
And you would send some pictures, I'll find them, from the plan of conservation and development, I think.
Right.
And this isn't right across the street, but it's only a few blocks
A couple
away.
blocks away, right. So we all went through the 1970s redevelopment period, right? Where some estimates said 75% of the buildings in Willimantic were knocked down.
Wow.
And there they were, right there, 7 acres of still empty space that's just sitting there. So our plan of conservation development, and you're a town planner,
Right.
you get it. This was written November of 2017, a year and a half ago, and it says, protect your historic buildings, they're the assets, and when you want to build new, build here on this, what is now the pink, is a parking lot. It's a 3-acre parking lot. Why wouldn't we be building there? It also, to the right would be where the famous Frog Bridge goes,
Right.
right next to that line of trees on the right. So we have a problem in Willimantic because our town is kind of split in half, the downtown, by this big empty lots. Nobody walks from one side to the other because there's nothing there. So what you want to do when you're doing urban planning is put some buildings there with some storefronts so that it makes people use their feet
Sure.
and walk up and down the street. That's what we want to have happen.
Yeah, the empty spots. You know, I think that partly people don't realize that cities, what makes you feel safe in cities is totally different from being in the country. If you're out, enjoying nature, that's fine if you're on an empty field. But if you pass a big empty space in the middle of a city, you don't feel safe there.
Right.
So we have a different configuration, but when the Gold Star Bridge was, when the second span was put up in the late 1960s, early 1970s, it was the same kind of thing. The north end of town, which is where the Coast Guard Academy is, where Connecticut College is,
Yeah, you lost it.
got separated from the downtown area, which is only about a mile away, but you can't get here from there because it's
just
so
uninviting.
it is totally uninviting.
Right.
The sidewalks are not good. There's shade. There are a lot of weird, unkept places.
Yeah.
And
That'll never get reconnected.
no, some things there are some good developments along that front, but it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
With
You have it going the other way too, right? After Bank Street, then you kind of get some empty lots there on the.
Yeah, those, and I have some pictures from New London too that we'll get to at a certain point. We have a lot of empty buildings and empty lots in New London. At one point, the whole, in the late 70s, early 80s, the Shaw's Cove neighborhood was demolished.
Right.
And it's an office park
Right.
now, and it is not totally utilized to this day.
And it's not an inviting area to walk past.
No, it is. Things are getting better.
Yeah.
There is an apartment complex that's being built on what's called Parcel J, which is on the corner of Bank and Howard Street.
Okay.
And
So that'll help fill in this gaps.
yeah, and in fact, when they did a study of that, the developer, at first the idea was to have a very city kind of formation of commercial use on the first floor and apartments up above, and the businesses across the street from that lot are all empty, like the business storefronts. So they're just putting residential there. Hopefully the intersection will be made walkable enough that people will feel comfortable crossing Bank Street there and crossing Howard Street there, because they're big, wide streets, and they don't
that's
feel
another problem. You're right. People don't want to cross our Frog Bridge, exactly. It's this big intersection. Nobody wants to cross it.
Although I love the Frog Bridge
We
itself.
love the bridge, but the intersection's not friendly. Yeah.
So
So why isn't this developer who's got $80 million dangling carrot in front of us, that everybody's going, whatever he wants? And we never meet this person. So whoever he is, whatever he is, he's invisible. We don't know anything he's ever done. He's a money manager. He's not a developer. But anyway, why is the town pointing him to knocking down these buildings first instead of building
where things were knocked down 30 years ago,
Right.
or 40 years ago.
And there are developers interested in the Hooker and the Hale hotels who would rehabilitate them and use them.
And here's another sort of.
Yeah, this is just artist rendering. So you can see the big empty lot there and the potential for buildings on the parking lot.
And when redevelopment, when that area, lost all of its buildings, I assume the intent was to build something bigger and better there.
That was the promise. Oh my goodness, I have some of the literature from that period promising all these wonderful things. You must have done it in New London. It happened all over the country. I was at a seminar recently, and the speaker was from Denver, and it was like 70 acres that just got demolished. Wow. And there's one little block that didn't get hit. And that's like the thriving little spot of Old Denver that everybody hangs out in, and that's where the cafes are. And they're,
Well, it's so much easier to reuse those places. Last year I led a Jane Jacobs Day walk in New London, and Laura Natush from New London Landmarks asked me if I'd do it, and I did. And I decided to talk about economic development, and we walked on Broad Street, and one end where the courthouse is, it's right near downtown, but it kind of stretches all the way out almost to the suburbs. It hooks up with Route 85 that goes out to Salem and Colchester. And you can just see in the old section that was built like around 1900, the late 1800s, it's very dense, very small storefronts, a lot of different kinds of restaurants, like hole in the wall, but there's a place you can get, Caribbean patties, curried
That's
goat.
what allows
there's
people to become
Chinese
entrepreneurs.
Place, there's
That's
a
fun,
Ecuadorian place. There's
Yes.
and all of them all together. If you add up
They're
the
not chain
acreage
restaurants.
of these 5 eateries, take up exactly the same acreage as the Dunkin' Donuts. So they probably hire more people. They certainly provide more variety.
They're providing whole
everyone.
families with food, right?
Yeah, and you know,
affordable. Yeah, and it's healthier.
and if one goes out of business, it doesn't take any time at all for a new business to move in to these little hole-in-the-wall places.
And Dunkin' Donuts is car dependent.
It is.
sure.
Most of it is. Well, the
all about
walk
that takeout
ended.
lanes.
It goes farther because you pass that whole Coleman Street car dealer area. We didn't walk quite that far. But there was a Rite Aid that was on a very big parcel, very big parking lot. The day after the walk, it was announced the Walgreens had purchased Rite Aid, and that Rite Aid was closed. So now it's a Family Dollar store. So fortunately, it's not sitting empty.
Yeah.
But it's kind of risky, compared to the natural turnover of the little spots.
Well, there's turnover in
Yeah.
in the family-owned businesses and in the corporate-owned
do.
businesses. Corporate, I think, doesn't want to stay open as long, trying to hang in there. What
Yeah.
I see is the little guy. They're going to give their heart and soul to that little store and keep it open as long as they can. Some are very successful. Some never really make it, and some just stay there for a long time, never getting rich. That's their life.
And if one goes under, then someone else will pick it up.
Oh yeah, because you can. Stores downtown is our new model, right? And so that was the whole idea, was to replicate what we were doing, what we have. Not what we're,
Right.
I can't take responsibility for that. What we were lucky enough to have, and duplicate it, and put housing on the top and retail on the first floors, but the rents are unaffordable for the retail. So they only can attract the chains, and the chains don't make it because they immediately pull the plug and say it's not making money. Students are only here 9 months.
Right.
So
And most of them are not big spenders.
well, they're spending a lot on rent. So then they don't have any extra money probably. Or they're the apartments now, it's not like dorms used to be. They're all apartments, so the kids cook at home. I think the grocery store does well. But anyway, it's interesting because we're all trying to struggle with getting a model that works for our old cities and making the urban city model work again.
Yeah.
And it takes jobs in there, and that's not being looked at in this development or this proposal that we're hearing. It needs some office space or something.
Right.
You need to have people living there and working there, and not necessarily the same people, but you got to keep it very dynamic day and night. You need entertainment.
Oh yeah, you need
People want
things.
something to do, right?
Yeah, it's a 24-hour thing.
Right.
So and I keep thinking that a lot of the small cities used to have kind of small-scale manufacturing, and
Well, we had
some
big
of
treadmills.
and that was actually pretty large-scale manufacturing. New London still has several buildings that were old factory buildings. Some have been repurposed, some have not. Some are empty and eyesores, and one, the Sheffield Tube Company that's on Broad Street that makes toothpaste. Actually, the dentist, Dr. Sheffield, who invented it, lived in a little house right on the same property. So now they, make and export toothpaste.
Well, they still do.
They still do.
Oh, right.
They still make toothpaste there. So it is a mix, but
Yeah.
I do think that some of the small scale manufacturing I don't think we want felt making or like the really polluting industry, but
You think like I do, which is like we're too old to think this because we don't know what the new industry is.
That's
it's
true.
Not
we don't.
manufacturing. I hear our state representative when she was in Hartford advocating for this horrible bill, RB 1107. You look it up. She was saying, we don't have a highway in town, so we have to do this. We have to do whatever it takes to get this money in because we have no highway.
Oh.
I'm like, the new industry doesn't depend
No,
on highways.
no,
the new entrepreneurs don't need a
no.
truck coming
Although
up
I do
to their
keep
door.
thinking, like, wouldn't
I
it be
think
great
that
if we
way.
could get some like hemp-based like paper mills or
Well, I think we have
fabric.
Willimantic Waste Paper, which is a
Oh,
huge
right.
importer of all the garbage and
including
recyclables
from New London.
from everywhere in the region. It comes all the way up to Willimantic, gets packaged into a smaller size and sent back out. I was just in Puerto Rico
Wow.
and in a little middle-class town, and I think this was the mayor talking to us, and he was saying they're so excited because they're going to have a toilet paper manufacturing plant. He said the next town over, they have something like the Willimantic Waste Paper,
Wow.
and his town's getting a toilet paper manufacturing. I'm like, why can't we do that? We have all this glass,
Yeah.
all this paper, all this metal that comes to our town, and we can't turn it into anything? Plastic.
Yeah.
Right?
That is funny.
So we should,
I mean-
even New England is the whole problem. But yeah, so the trucks are all coming here, so we should be sending them out with something. But that manufacturing isn't ideal in a town that doesn't have a highway. And this is part of the state of Connecticut's problem.
Although there are train
Connecticut,
tracks
There's
that they're
train
not
tracks.
used.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
But there are trains.
And
There
we use
could
it.
be.
Yes.
Yeah. At one time, there was a train, even when not
Yeah.
so long ago that I don't remember it.
Oh,
went
the
from
passenger.
the passenger train that went
Yeah.
from New London to Montreal.
We loved it. Yes, yes. But there's freight trains every day.
There are
that.
still freight trains.
And we use them in this businesses in Willimantic, including the Willimantic Waste Paper that use the trains. So yeah, there's definitely that potential too.
So here's like just more of that conceptual site plan from the plan of conservation and development. And
So that's what the plan is. So on my left, is that the same as on the screen's left, is that U shape is the Hotel Hooker and Nathan Hale hotels. That would be what was there, they're planning to put there. The one next to it, that little empty lot you pointed
Yeah.
out, that's that building.
oh,
And then the other one is there's a parking lot. So you see the Savings Institute is on Main Street, and that's
Right.
not getting knocked down. That's that 2 squares that are remaining intact. And then the parking lot behind that building would all become a big.
oh my gosh.
So this developer.
This actually does not look that attractive.
It doesn't.
Let me just-
It's like he didn't follow the zoning regs. That is about 8 stories high, and the zoning regs say you can only be 6. But the little house that's next to the Nathan Hale building is, a little house. It's a 2-story residential place with a barber shop on the first floor. It's not really in keeping with the size of the buildings around it. Even the Savings Institute's only 3 stories. It's kind of going to be very big, and the zoning recently changed to not require any parking. So that's going to be an issue. So where are people going to park? Are they all really going to take the bus?
I'm
I hope
guessing
so.
that the
We
rents will
want
be
them
very
to.
high.
Well, we've been promised market rate, as high as they can make them, because that will attract people to our town who have a lot of money. And
This is so familiar sounding.
it's not at all for the people who live here.
And I really think it's fine if wealthy people want to live in New
Sure.
London or in
Yes.
Willimantic, but we can't pay them to move to our cities.
Right. Well, this is the opportunity zone thing. So opportunity zones were created under Trump's last tax plan. And what they do is they attract equity investors, people who have capital gains. So if you bought a building, a house in Malibu, and you want to sell it and you want to take that extra $1 million, what will you do with the extra $1 million? Well, you don't want to pay taxes on it, right?
Heaven forbid.
Heaven forbid. So what you can do is invest it in one of these opportunity zones, which are all over the country. And so right now it's a game for these funding companies to try to attract all these people who have potential capital gains that they have to hide.
So really, it seems like an old story that there are zones, because enterprise zones are not a national thing, but they're also opportunities for wealthy people to have businesses in distressed communities that the people who live in those communities really can't buy into at all.
Yeah, right. And when they avoid all the taxes, we're the ones going to pay those taxes. The people who are going to work every day and taxes come out of our paychecks, we don't have a choice. So we pay your taxes and you get to invest. But okay, let's throw all that aside and think, isn't this wonderful? $80 million of investment after the government, 40 years ago knocked down our cities. Finally, the government's telling people invest in the cities. But they don't have to do all housing. They could support existing businesses. They can create businesses. They can create commercial spaces. But the return on investment in housing is the most because they can rent it for the highest per square foot. So they want to do housing.
Well, when you mention return on investment, I think one of my favorite economists is Art Rolnick, because he, about 20 years ago, he decided, he worked for the Minneapolis Fed, and he decided that instead of municipalities giving abatements and incentives of other sorts to high rollers to come move in, he said that doesn't work. It doesn't create jobs. It moves jobs around, but it doesn't actually create anything. Yeah. He decided that the best thing for cities to invest in is education.
Oh, wow.
And that is where you get your best return on investment over the years.
Wow.
And especially preschool education. I was a preschool teacher, so I
so
learned
you
about
that
him.
Article, Art.
And he has, I think he's a private consultant now, but he writes articles about how futile it is to build publicly funded sports stadiums and a lot like what just happened in Hartford and and other kinds of incentives.
Oh, remember when it was convention centers? Everyone had to have a convention center, and you don't need all this.
You don't need all of it.
They don't bring anybody into the city. They just brought them to the convention center. I've gone to conventions in lots of cities. I didn't see anything in the city.
No, they're very self-contained.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons that I asked you to come on the show was that this legislation that removes protection from those 4 towns in Connecticut would really affect New London. And I was getting really nervous just learning about this. This is the Capitol Theater. I don't have any interior pictures on the show, but they're available on the internet. And it's both glorious and frightening inside because the roof went unrepaired for many years. But, the facade has been part of Bank Street for a long time, and it has been closed for a long time. This could be really threatened
absolutely
by this kind
would definitely come
of change in legislation. It was built in 1921.
So we could put 6 stories there. What do you think?
Yeah, and it probably would be kind of a boring
Oh,
six
yeah.
stories too.
Depends on your design regulations, I guess. But it won't be the
We
good
have an
construction.
advisory facade review
Yeah.
process, but
You really can't control.
yeah, it's really hard. If someone wants to invest a lot of money, it's very hard to tell them how they should be doing it.
Yep.
This building is a Cronin building. It has not, it's an old building. It's on State Street. The building on the left is also an old building. The one on the right, I don't know what used to be there. It's Caruso's Music now. It was the S&T building. It obviously is a newer, boring, squarish brick building. But, you know, this has a prime location. It's right across from the plaza and the Nathan Hale Schoolhouse.
So.
And it has been vacant for a long time. And, I mean...
That would be a nice one to take down and build something.
Yeah, if someone were so motivated.
Well, the opportunity zone is with motivation now. It's like, let's...
And this building, this is actually a very good picture of this building. Anyone who has gone down Bank Street recently knows that it's boarded up. This was one of the buildings that we went to the state and was it the Attorney General?
Attorney General, yeah.
But, you know, it is undergoing demolition by neglect at this point in time.
So that is the problem. How do you, once an owner owns it, how do you force them to do anything, like fix the roof? But I like this because it's a good example of, with the Nathan Hale and the hotel, people say, especially the hotel hooker, that building is just a brick building. What's the big deal? Why do you want to save it? And it's the character of the town. It's not that individual building. And,
you know, I think that in the old towns, too, the streetscapes kind of evolved the way they did for a reason, because it worked in a walkable downtown.
Yeah, it was walkable. I'm looking, this is so obviously missing a building next to it.
Yes, there... Yeah,
something's clearly missing here.
There is a big alleyway, and this I'll go a little farther down the street in the other direction towards the right. Because the last building was 130. The Salvation Army, I think, is 166, and the lot is 174. Now, this is half a block away from that building, and the lot on the right is actually a hole in the ground. The sidewalk is above. Of Bank Street is above the level of the hole, which is at the level of South Water Street behind it. Yeah. Someone could build quite a large building, and I think the Salvation Army building was built in 1965, but it wasn't particularly well built. I don't think there are great ways it could be made nice. I think of what happened in Willimantic, the building that now houses Cafe Mantic.
Right.
That was a very
Actually,
kind of a similar.
Pretty similar.
Yes, it was a very utilitarian building that probably was built in the 60s.
Yep, but it had concrete floors, and it's a really solid building. So there's just no reason to take it down. I mean, the waste. Construction has a lot of heavy carbon footprint in general, even starting from new construction, and then when you add the demolition, and it's just appalling in terms of the carbon footprint. It takes apparently about 45 years to recover back to zero carbon footprint, the impact of a demolition and rebuild.
So just from an environmental point of view too, even though it's expensive to do the remediation in old buildings, it's still so much more environmentally sound than turning everything to rubble and starting from scratch.
And those buildings are usually very energy efficient because they were not foolish. They had to heat them. It wasn't free. So they're usually, you know, big solid walls. They hold their heat, they hold their cold. And and then there's job creation. If you do renovation, you create more jobs.
And they're all local jobs too. That's one of the great things about construction jobs. It's like
we're not importing the
Yeah, it
Right.
has to be done locally.
Yep, it's hands
So
on.
unlike, pens and cups and things, they can be manufactured anywhere and shipped fairly inexpensively here.
This
That kind
construction
of
has to be
job,
done
it
hands-on.
has to be done by local people.
Right.
So the money generated actually circulates within our
And-
communities
And
more.
we have wonderful federal tax credits and state historic tax credits that will offset all those costs. So they've done analysis on these two buildings, and I'm sure it's true of any historical building. They get the tax credits, it offsets all that extra expense that might be involved, and you save money. It's cheaper to rebuild. So I guess what we're hoping for is to find this win-win-win situation, but I don't even know who we're talking to here.
No, and I guess one of the
But
the
the bill
points
is
is that
bad.
people should call their state
Right.
reps and state senators. We only have 5 minutes left.
Ah,
But there is,
Yes.
you won't be able to read this, but we'll put this on the screen briefly. Well, or we might, yes. Bill 1107 is the one that removes the protection in the
Right.
opportunity zones in the distressed municipalities that have less than
30,000
30,000 people in them if the building's 10 years old. So,
The irony is, it doesn't affect the two buildings they're trying to do because they're already in the process. So I don't even know why they're doing this, just to be spiteful and mean to every other old building. I
don't know, but one thing people can do is,
Yes, right.
it's too late to provide testimony, it's out of committee, but you can certainly call your legislators and say, this would be damaging. And
Right.
if you live in one of the 4 towns that impacted, that's great, but even if you don't live in those towns that
Yeah.
are impacted, imagine what it would be like. There's another bill that came to my attention also, House Bill 7410 or Senate Bill 877, which are basically the same thing, that seem to be putting a ceiling on the amount of tax credits
Right.
people can get. So anyone who is trying to
Apply for them. Apply
yeah.
for them. So this has been a problem ongoing. They use all the tax credits that are available every year because there's so many buildings in need of these. And I mean, in Willimantic, we've saved many buildings, and they're occupied, and there are people living there. I'm sure that's true here. You use tax credits
sure.
all the time. For some reason, our state legislator also said, "Oh, we don't need tax credits. This isn't Greenwich." And I'm like, we need the tax credits
we do.
because we're not Greenwich.
Well, yeah, you think
course.
about New London, also right downtown, like the Hygienic, when it was restored about 20 years ago, it was almost demolished and turned into a parking lot. And really, Jim Stidful, one of the people who was really at the forefront of saving that building, said without all the tax credits and the programs available, it could not have been done.
Right.
So
right.
that can make the difference between being able to save something
Right.
and not being able to do it.
And the fact that we have them is just such a good positive evidence that the state and the people of the state care about the historic buildings, and we love them, and we want to keep them, and we value this. So why are we taking those things away? We want to increase them, if anything.
And especially in our poorer municipalities, it seems like our resources
Yeah.
are getting destroyed.
Right. It just
Like,
makes
please
absolutely no
don't.
sense. But I mean, this applies to anyone who lives in any town, who loves, maybe they live in an old farmhouse, or in any community here. Connecticut is full of old buildings. Certainly, if you live in Connecticut, you probably appreciate the old buildings.
So yes, call your legislators. House Bill 1107 is the one that impacts the 4 towns, but
Yes.
could really have a very negative impact on all of them.
Tax credit.
And the
bill.
tax credit bills 7410 and 877 as well. So, well, thank
Yeah.
you, Jean. I think
Thank
we're out of
you.
time. I'm glad you came down. We could have
I'm
probably.
just so glad that you having me on the show. It's good. I really hope people in New London get active about this, and Pomfret, Putnam, out there
Yeah.
in the northeast corner. This is going to affect you, and your legislator, Senator May Flexer, is definitely backing this bad legislation as a favor to her friend Susan Johnson. So you need to be
Yeah,
active.
and it isn't really a partisan thing. It's actually, in a way, bipartisanship at its worst.
Not. It's not.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
when it came out of committee, it was kind of a bipartisan vote, but it was interesting that there's, you go to these hearings and there's like 5 legislators there maybe listening to any of it. The 5 who were there voted against this bill, and then May Flexer
Interesting.
left the room when I was speaking, and Greg Haddad from Mansfield left the room when I was speaking, and when they came back when Susan Johnson spoke, right?
Oh.
So
Oh.
it was so gross. It's Democrats who are backing it for a favor for Susan Johnson. And that's a lousy piece of legislation. You don't make legislation as a favor to one legislator that has a negative effect on all these other towns. Bad
On that
legislation.
note,
We're out of time.
we're out of time.
I must have forgotten to say
Next
something.
week, Fresh New London, I'm not sure who will be on from the organization, but we'll be talking about food security in Southeast Connecticut. So we'll see you then.
Oh, that's
And
gonna be
thank
good.
you, Jean.
Thank you.
Looming.